Hello there, welcome to video 16 in our flipped classroom series. Today marks the last video of our unit, but also the last video of the year. So today's essential question is, how did social movements impact Quebec society during the Quiet Revolution? In order to answer that question, please be reminded of our success criteria. I can name the movements that occurred during the Revolution, which were the Union movement, secularism, and the feminist movement. That you can indicate the demands made by each of the movements, and that you can provide examples of how the government intervened regarding demands made by the movements. Let's get started.
Come gather round, people, wherever you roam.
During Duplessis' reign as the Premier of Quebec, the Catholic Church was responsible for a lot of health and education services. Catholic Church played a leading role throughout Duplessis' terms in office, and he used his close relationship with the Church to spread his conservative, traditional, nationalist ideas throughout the province. However, as society was modernizing, you began to see the role of the Church diminish. In fact, there was a movement called secularization. Secular means the process of removing religion from institutions. So in the 1950s, the church could no longer manage numerous social institutions. And little by little, you began to see educational as well as social establishments remove the role of religion in them. The church's role continued to decline throughout the 60s. In fact, with the onset of the Quiet Revolution in 1960, you began to see the church, which no longer was responsible for social services, health, and education, experience a significant decline in its influence, and this was noticeable because the number of people attending church fell significantly. In Montreal, from 1961 to 1971, you saw the rate of attendance drop from 61% down to about 30%. Also significant is the fact that the number of priests fell from about 8,000 in 1960 down to about just over 4,000 in 1981. So it was very significant, but it was also very clear now that the role of the church in Quebec had diminished significantly. Next, we look at the union movement. So before the revolution, during the 1950s, more and more workers united in union organizations so that they could demand better working conditions. Duplessis did not trust unions, which he believed had like revolutionary ideas, and they posed a threat to the public order. In Maurice Duplessis' view, the province's prosperity was connected to the presence of large private enterprise. Unions, of course, fought for public employees. So one example of sort of this conflict between Duplessis and unions was the asbestos strike. In 1949, approximately 5,000 workers in the asbestos mines in Thetford mines went on strike. Among their demands were the elimination of asbestos dust as well as an increase in wages. Oftentimes, though, when there was striking, there was violence, and Duplessis would bring in the police to forcefully intervene, and this resulted in a number of injuries. In spite of these sometimes violent confrontations, the rise of the union movement continued throughout the 60s and into the 70s. Throughout the 60s, the number of unions doubled in Quebec, rising from 400,000 to nearly 850,000 by 1984. Once again, the reason or the overall purpose of these unions was to continue to fight or protest for better working conditions for their members. By the 1970s, the union movement began to see many changes as a result of their protests. The government responded to many union movements by granting them access to free health services as well as better health and social services. There were also a number of social changes that took place, which was they granted free medication for seniors as well as maternity leave for employees. So all of these changes took place in the workplace. By 1978, you also began to see things like the Régie de l'assurance automobile, so the Quebec Automobile Insurance Board, compensate victims of road accidents. So one thing to keep in mind about unions is oftentimes if a union is protesting for, say higher work wages or improved working conditions, they will usually strike, which means that they stop working. The goal of this is so that the government, who would want their employees to return to work, would often meet their demands. But the thing to keep in mind is that sometimes these things drag on for a very long time, and sometimes it can get rather ugly or violent. But the union movements of the Quiet Revolution were significant because the government did respond to a number of their demands. So before the revolution ever began, you began to see the feminist movement take effect. During World War II, many women moved into the labor force as men went overseas to fight in the war. However, when the war ended, men came back and were expected to return to their jobs, and women were expected to leave the workforce and return to their stereotypical gender role of looking after the family. The problem with this is that women felt very discriminated against when they were simply expected to leave the workforce. They gained a lot of independence and autonomy when they began to work for themselves, and so this was a point of contention. During the Quiet Revolution, women were increasingly active in the job market as they were gaining better educations. The number of working women rose from 26.5% in 1960 up to nearly 50% by the 80s. Of course, there were still a lot of things to fight for. The big one being equality.
Well, the main demand, of course, is equal rights. Equal rights to have a job, to have respect, to not be viewed as a piece of meat. Equal rights to set forth our own humanity. Equal rights to get into graduate programs, to get into schools, to training programs. We're the bottom third of the employment in terms of pay. We represent, nonetheless, 34% of the workforce, yet we're the first to be laid off and the last to be hired. There aren't frivolous demands at all. We just want what men have had all these years.
In the 1960s, feminist groups rallied around the question of the status of women. They began to demand legal status for women that would be equal to men. They wanted to have access to the same jobs that had traditionally been reserved for men, and they wanted better representation in politics. Another area that they fought for, was pay discrimination. Women were being paid lower wages than men for the same job, and so women were insistent on trying to fight for equality between men and women, and they wanted it to be recognized by the government. As more and more women began to join the labor force in the 1960s, it began to influence feminist demands that would take place during the 1970s and 80s. While continuing to struggle for equal pay, women also began to demand maternity leave and the establishment of daycares. During the same period, unions were also supporting demands for maternity leave, and in 1974, the government adopted a policy for daycare. At that time as well, you began to see different feminist groups join forces to increase their influence, and they organized demonstrations, protests, and they demanded, among other things, the right for abortion. One other thing to talk about for a moment was in the 60s, specifically in the early 60s, and this was something that really drastically changed women's lives. And this was the advent or the creation of the contraceptive pill, also known as the birth control pill. And this granted women the right to sort of decide if and when they wanted to have children. And from this point on, you began to see families grow smaller in size, right? Having less children. Thanks for watching video 16. Before going, I just want to remind you the essential question is, how did social movements impact Quebec society during the Quiet Revolution? And also, here's our success criteria, that you can name the movements that occurred during the revolution, which were the union movement, secularism, and the feminist movement. That you can indicate the demands made by each of the movements, and that you can provide examples of how the government intervened regarding demands made by the movements. Finally, guys, we will be taking up this topic further in class, where we will begin to look at a little bit of the shift from traditional values into these more modern ideas, and we will also be discussing in greater detail sort of the effects that these movements had in later society. So thanks for watching, and have a good day.